Good afternoon from Moscow, good evening, or whatever is appropriate wherever you find yourself. Welcome to this final webinar in what has been something of a webinar marathon today. And thank you very much for those of you who I see from the comments section have been with us for many of the webinars that we've been doing today. Welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. You are very welcome aboard. And I hope wherever you are, your day is going well and that everything is fine. Forgive me those of you who have been in the previous webinars, but I do have to just quickly give those technical notes for those who have just joined us. If you have problems of a technical nature, if you wish to know about certificates, etc., please address your comment to my colleague Svetlana, and please do so in Russian. Anything that you wish to communicate to me, please feel free to either send a question, make a comment, or write in the comments section. But please, in English, I can read names and things, but I'm afraid my Russian is not good enough to answer questions. As always, at the end of the webinar, I will happily give you an email address on which you can contact me should you wish to discuss anything further. If you feel I left anything out, or if there's anything you'd like to disagree with, I would very happily continue those discussions with you. So that's the technical information out of the way. These sessions normally go on for about 45 minutes, give or take just a couple of minutes, just so you know. If you haven't made your coffee or your tea, then, oh well. There will be no advertising breaks, so I'm afraid you're stuck with us now until the end. We are very happy to have you here, and I have to confess I do have my coffee here, so I'm well organized. This last session follows on the heels of the previous webinar, in which we talked a little bit about communication theory and the elements of good communication. In this last session, we're going to look very closely at the idea of writing. Writing is a communicative skill, obviously, and it is one that we have found over the years is something that teachers are concerned about. Quite often when I go and visit teachers in schools, when I go for visits, discussions with colleagues, one of the first things I will always do is ask them, you know, what they're happy about, what they're worried about, just so I can get an idea of the kind of information that I can give them that would be helpful to them. 9 times out of 10, certainly in schools where learners are at the higher levels, moving into maybe exam level, what I always hear is that learners are worried, the teachers are worried about their learners' writing skills. So we felt it was appropriate to put a presentation together on that. There will be connections between this and the previous one, as I said, about communication. But here we're going to specifically look at writing and specifically look at it in the context of a kind of higher, kind of around a B2 level writing activity, because earlier on today we focused a little bit more on primary in general. So let us start at the beginning. One of the first questions I usually ask teachers when we talk about writing compositions is basically, sorry, I was just checking something, is basically to ask them why we write compositions. And these are the responses that I normally get. Certainly, one of the reasons we ask learners to write compositions is, let's be honest, for exam preparation. And I'm not going to pretend that that is a bad thing. I'm not going to say that learners should not be taught to write compositions for exams. I know that you live in the real world. I also taught in the real world, and I know that a teacher has a responsibility to prepare learners for examinations to be able to get them through. So certainly as we move into the higher levels of language education, quite a bit of what we do in terms of teaching writing is to enable learners to get through examinations. Another element that teachers often look at and we discuss is this idea of language development. So for example, if we've been focusing in a particular unit or a module or whatever, however we divide up our learning, if we are focusing on, let's say, tenses, let's say future tenses, for example, then we will ask our learners to do some writing, a composition or whatever that encourages them, is probably the nice way of saying it, but forces is also probably a fair term. It encourages our learners to use future tenses. So there are styles of composition that we often look at, especially in course books, that favor specific linguistic or grammatical structures, lexical areas and grammar, and that's fine as well. Sometimes those of you who are maybe working at the higher level, maybe some of you are working in technical colleges, and you are looking at English for specific purposes. Maybe you're teaching learners writing skills that will help them when they are in their chosen profession, whatever that may happen to be. Now, that may not be email and writing reports and proposals. That may be filling out forms. That may be keeping records of stock. It may be any number of different things, and that is equally valid. What is not valid is a response that kind of I do get, especially in seminars, when teachers are honest, and why do we write compositions? Because it's in the textbook. Because on page 52 it says we should write a composition, and that's what we're going to do. Now, obviously there's a truth in that. It is in the textbook. But I would argue that that's not a good reason for thinking that we're writing the composition, and I know that if we're honest, you will agree with me. The reason why that is the case is because I must know what my aim is to enable me to start teaching the composition writing effectively. So just to take some of the things we've been talking about. Exam preparation, for example. If I am preparing learners for a specific kind of exam, now that could be an international exam, it could be the Russian national exam, it could be whatever. It could be a school exam, some schools have internal examinations and tests. Then that is going to determine the type of composition I'm going to spend time teaching my learners. So if it's exam focused, certainly I would know, or I should know, what composition styles are tested in an examination. And that information is usually available. If it's an international exam, you will certainly find that information on the website of the particular organization that administers the exam. And if it's something like the Russian national exam, of course, you would know better than better than me. Sorry, it's been a long afternoon. You would know better than me. Who is what types are responsible for what types are required. Sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. I'm reading things and looking at the camera. What kind of compositions are required for that particular exam? So there's number one. Know what we're doing, know what that entails in terms of the styles. Also the length of the composition. Most exam bodies give details on the length. So it may be 250 words at certain levels. It may be 200, 180. It just depends. In the young learners exams we looked at this morning, learners were asked to write a short composition of about 20 words. So the number of words tends to change, obviously, with the level of the exam. But we need to know that, because if our learners are writing a composition which is in beautiful English, but it's supposed to be, let's say, for example, 180 words, and if they express themselves in 250, now the English may be great, and it's nice when students write a lot. As teachers, I'm sure we like that. But if it's exam preparation I'm interested in, that's a problem, because my learner has to learn to express themselves in the correct number of words. And if they can't, that is something I need to help them with. If I'm not particularly worried about exams, then they can write as much as they want, and that's not an issue there. But I have to be aware of what the terms are for the exam and what's expected of my learners. Time. This is another big issue. Certainly, part of the problem here is, of course, that certainly the higher levels, composition work tends to be done at home. Learners tend to write compositions at home and bring them into the school, which means that, in all truth, I have no idea how long it took my learner to write that particular composition. But I do need to know if my focus is exams. One of the suggestions we always make in this case is that learners should be encouraged, therefore, to do some composition writing in class. Not every composition, not every week. But at certain points throughout the year, if you're concerned about exams, it would be a very, very, very useful thing, because then you can see how our learners are doing in terms of their timing. Can they manage it in the time, or do they need help with that? Another thing I would suggest is that if you are going to do exam-style composition writing in the classroom, which I have suggested, please don't do it at the last minute before the exam. It is something you need to do with enough time to fix a problem if there is a problem. If you find out 2 weeks before the exam, for argument's sake, that your learner cannot write the composition in the time allowed, there's not a huge amount of chance to fix that particular problem. And if you can't fix it, it may not be a good idea to upset the learner a week or 2 weeks before their examination, because then you have issues with their psychology, and that may prove to be problematic when they finally get into the examination. So if you're going to have these kind of practice composition writing things, please make sure you do it with enough time to rectify any problems. Of course, then the question comes up, why is the learner taking too long to write a composition? It may be that they're spending too long thinking about it in the planning stage. Maybe they don't plan at all and they get lost and confused as they go through. Maybe they spend a long time writing it and then sitting down and rewriting the whole thing from scratch. I'll be honest with you, writing a composition out twice in an exam is not necessarily a good idea. Usually there is not enough time in an examination to write the whole thing and then write the whole thing out again. This is where planning comes in. This is where learners need to be able to sit down and think things through very quickly, and these are things we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. So if it's exam preparation, these are things that matter. If you're thinking about language development, absolutely fine. It's a different focus. It'll change what we're looking at. It'll change the style of composition we give. Obviously, as I've mentioned, the composition will be full of different structures, different tenses, different lexical areas, different vocabulary will be going on there. It is arguable that if I'm interested, for example, in learners using, let's say, the passive voice, and I have a composition that encourages the use of the passive voice, I'm going to be focusing my marking far more on their passive constructions and how well they create those, and how well they write them, how well they use them, and possibly less concerned with it being a superb piece of writing. As long as it's written grammatically in the way that I need it to be written, my learner can be considered to be successful for the most part in that particular writing. So do be careful there that you know what you're looking for and mark accordingly, because sometimes, again, we lose sight of that when we're marking composition. If it's for work or study, of course, the styles of composition are going to usually be much, much more limited. And please remember, this is something I talk about when we talk about English for specific purposes, and I have done a video on that for Prosвещение, and if you are interested, I think it's available on their website. It was a few years ago. I looked a little bit different, but I think it's still available. Please remember that different professions have different styles of writing. I was talking with some colleagues the other day about this. So, for example, if you are teaching in a technical college and you're teaching, I don't know, the example we used was hairstylists, people working in a beauty salon. It would be inappropriate for you to say, okay, your homework for this evening is to write a composition on the advantages and disadvantages of having curly hair. No one, no hairstylist would ever write such a thing. What they might have to write, for example, are keeping records of their regular customers, what hair dye they used, what number they used, so that they can get the same hair color each time. They may need to have a written record if their clients are allergic to any chemicals that might be in hair dyes or any hair treatment that they use. So that kind of writing would be legitimate. For or against would not be a legitimate style of writing. So again, if our focus is work, we have to focus on the writing that learners would legitimately be asked to do in a work situation. If you are a business person, you're working in a company, then yes, there will be the email, the proposals, the reports, etc., etc., etc. So please bear in mind the real life situation in which the learner will find themselves and which they will have to write. Also, of course, just to finish this one, if you're looking at work or study, lexical choices become much more defined and more limited to a certain extent. If you are writing, for example, you're an engineer and you're doing some kind of writing, the terminology that you use will be very clearly defined and really quite limited. So again, this is something you need to look out for if you are teaching at a vocational institution, getting the right style of writing, but also making sure that that writing activates and utilizes the correct kind of vocabulary, terminology, and everything that would be needed in that situation. Very important, just to finish that kind of introductory part, we must know our goals. If we just do it because it's in the course book, it's no use to anybody, and it's no use to us as teachers. If we don't know the purpose behind setting the composition or the writing and giving the learners that work, as I've already touched on, not only is it partially, it's vague, we give vague information to our learners, at the same time, we don't necessarily know what we're marking. We need to know why we're giving it, to be able to know why we mark the way we mark. That will help us standardize our marking, that will help us be fair in our marking, so that we give the learners the mark that they deserve. So please always know why and the consequences of that in terms of what you're going to mark and what would be considered success and what would be considered failure. That's very, very important indeed. Know your goals. I think that's a good life message as well. Now, if you want to think about it philosophically as well. Okay, so we started our composition in the sense that we've thought about what we're going to write. We've got in our heads what we need them to do, what will be our sign of success. So now we're going to work with our learners, and we're going to try and generate ideas. Please notice the order in which I have arranged these ideas, because I do believe that's very, very important. I have not jumped to planning the composition. I have not jumped to paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. I want you to have that in mind now, and please, if you would be so kind, I've deliberately arranged these stages in a way that I think is helpful to you. You may or may not agree with that, but I just wanted to draw that to your attention. It's my job and my pleasure to try and be as helpful as I can. I just need to sip some water. Excuse me 1 second. The problem was not with your microphone. The problem was I'm working in an air-conditioned area, and unfortunately it dries my throat just a little bit. So if we're looking especially at things like exams, but also learners need to be able to follow instructions generally, asking for clarification of the rubric is always very, very important. If we are bearing in mind exams, and I know many of you teach at those levels, answering the wrong composition question, it's been a long day. There's going to be more of that before we finish. Answering the wrong composition is a mark loser. Learners can fail examinations simply because they didn't answer the question correctly. Nothing to do with their English. I remember many years ago I had a student who was doing FCE, and I asked him after he came out of the exam about the composition that he had written, and he said, oh, you had to write a story which included the phrase, whatever the phrase was, but he very clearly said included the phrase. This sounded to me a little unusual. I said included the phrase or begins or ends with the phrase, because that's what the question would normally be. No, he said it, which includes the phrase. So a few weeks later, I got hold of the exam paper and I looked at the question, and the question very clearly said, write a composition which ends with the phrase. And I know that he will have lost marks because he didn't follow the instructions in the rubric. So it's very, very important, especially if we're looking at exams, that we get learners to focus very clearly on the task in hand. So when we look at things, this is one I've taken from our books. Remember, I've taken them from different books where we do writing. So this isn't one particular course book. You're going to find them all over the place. This one says, credit cards, a curse or a blessing? We're looking for articles on this subject. What are the pros and cons of shopping on credit? Now, whenever I ask a group of teachers, I can't do it here so easily, but whenever I ask a group of teachers, what is this composition about? The answer always comes back, or usually always comes back, the advantages and disadvantages of credit cards. But if you look very carefully at the question, it doesn't say that. It says, what are the pros and cons of shopping on credit? And that's a very specific It's definitely for and against format, but it's for and against shopping on credit. It's not about credit cards in general. Now, you may argue, okay, but what else do you do with a credit card? For example, when I travel, because I'm away from home a lot and I can be away from home when bills come in, I have connected my bills to my credit card so that when I travel, my bills get paid automatically from my credit card. Now, that's not shopping. And that's a very different thing. It allows me to make sure that I pay people for my phone bill and whatever else it happens to be. And then I just go online to my web banking, I pay my credit card, and everyone's happy except me because I have to pay for stuff. But that is not about shopping on credit. Do you see the subtle difference? So what we have to make sure, especially at the higher levels, as our learners get into more complex language and they have to deal with more complex subjects, we have to make sure that they focus very carefully. It would be very easy here for them just to say, oh, advantages and disadvantages of credit cards. And a lot of what they write would be relevant, but not necessarily all of it. So please, always get them to focus on that. What exactly are you being asked to do? Underline the words. Find the words that tell you what you're supposed to be doing, especially for examinations. And then we get on to the fun stuff. Brainstorming. So now we've established what we're doing, the advantages and disadvantages of shopping with credit cards. Then we brainstorm. Now, I don't know about you, when I was teaching composition writing, it was quite often a very lonely experience. I'd stand in front of my class and I'd say, okay, tonight's composition is about the advantages and disadvantages of shopping on credit. Ideas. And quite often I was met with a kind of stony silence from my learners, looking at the floor and the ceiling, which is something I tease teachers about, not willing to answer, partially because they suspected that there was a right answer that I was looking for that they might not know. Brainstorming is a very important part of the writing process. For all styles of composition, to be honest with you, for all kinds of writing that we might do, people working in business, people who are being creative, even if you're writing an email sometimes, a straightforward email, just having that little bit of thinking about it beforehand. So I thought it would be useful, and it certainly was to me, to share some ideas about brainstorming. Because what you don't want to do is what quite often teachers do for the right reasons, but it's the wrong thing. For the right reasons, teachers will offer ideas. You know, they'll say, so what do you think about credit cards, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll be met with silence. And then they'll say, well, okay, what about this, this, and this? And the teacher will give the learners some ideas because they're trying to be helpful, and that's in the nature of being a good teacher. The problem with that, of course, is that then you end up getting 20-odd compositions coming back to you, which all essentially tell you the same thing that you just thought, and that is not helpful. It's not helpful because it's boring to mark. It's not helpful because it's not really teaching the learners to express themselves. They're basically expressing your ideas. It's not helpful for exam preparation because when a learner is in an exam, if that is what our focus is, and they're faced with a rubric in an exam which says write a composition on subject X, they can't turn around and say to you, teacher, what should I write here? Learners have to make that decision for themselves, and very importantly, they have to make it very quickly. So practicing and improving brainstorming skills is a very important part of this process. And you'll notice I have put it before structuring the composition. This is before we get into structure. Learners need to think quickly. So let me make some suggestions about brainstorming and how we can maybe make it work just a little bit better in the classroom. First and foremost, define and agree the objective. Let your learners know what we're trying to brainstorm about. We're trying to decide A or B or C. The more defined I can make it, and to be fair, the more restricted I make it, the easier it is to brainstorm. What we can do in the classroom situation is to actually kind of mess about, tinker with it a little bit, and give our learners an opinion. Let me explain what I mean. If, for example, we're doing the advantages and disadvantages of shopping on credit, I will separate one side of the class, I separate the class into two. One side of the class will be thinking of the advantages, one the disadvantages. This is because it's quite hard to think of two conflicting things at the same time. If I ask my learners to think of the advantages and the disadvantages, I'm asking them to basically do a kind of mental flip where they're trying to think of both sides of the argument at the same time. And that's actually quite difficult. It's not really what the brain is designed to do. So it's much better to give them one objective. And in this case, it's a binary one, for and against. It may be that there are more complex elements to the question. It may be describe, the current situation in the environment, what is damaging it, how can this problem be solved? Now, basically, you have three issues there. What's the problem? Describe the current state of the environment. What's causing these problems? How can we solve it? That's three steps. There, you could divide the class into three. That would be a great thing to do. So if you can do that, and you will find quite often that this is more productive, because now my learner doesn't have to decide what they think. They basically have to support the idea that they've been given. And it's surprising how much they can actually produce. If you haven't tried this, please do, because I have always found it produces more ideas. So we give them then a time limit. A time limit is important, I think, for two basic reasons. Firstly, you need to keep your lesson under control. You don't want to spend 20 minutes trying to get ideas out of your learners. That's not how it works. And again, if we're thinking about examinations, in an exam, a learner does not have 20 minutes to stare at the ceiling and come up with ideas. I would strongly recommend, and again, I have tried these, give your learners a time limit, and honestly, it could be just a couple minutes. In most of the compositions that learners would be asked to write, certainly up to B2 level, and arguably a little bit higher, finding 4 or 5 maximum 4 or 5 good ideas is enough. In fact, in some compositions, at maybe B1 level, they can get away with about 3. You do not need 20 minutes to come up with that. So give them a time limit, but be strict with it. Say you now have a minute, 2 minutes to find 10 for, 10 against. Now, what we're trying to do there, the other reason why a time limit I think is important, is because learners tend to second guess. They tend to try and think what they're supposed to think, what the right answer is. And what I want at brainstorming level is not the right answer. I just want ideas. I want them out there. Once they're out there, we can start playing around with them. So giving them that time limit will also put that little bit of pressure on them just to kind of get anything out there. And I think that's very important indeed. That little bit of pressure, just write it down, just get it there. And you can get them working in teams, in groups, individually. That's entirely up to you. There are ways, in fact, you can make this into games. I can't get into them right now because it's very hard to explain without actually showing you. But you can make brainstorming into games as well. But the time limit, very, very important. Please don't forget it and don't overestimate. It's better to give them a little short time than it is to give them too long. If it gets too long, they just end up staring at the ceiling and misbehaving. Once you get the ideas in, then this is when we start arranging our thoughts. I would recommend, I know this sounds a bit weird, when you write ideas that come from brainstorming, when you write them on the board, and you should, as they come from your students, note them on the board, please don't put them in a list. I always advise, and again, this is based on research, that they should be written on the board in a random fashion. The reason for that is as human beings, we tend to, we like to look at hierarchies, we like to find systems, we like to guess what's best and what isn't. If you have a list, number 1 in the list is always going to be what people think is the most important or the best. And it may be that the first idea that comes out is not. Also, in terms of memory, and this is based on the work of people like Tony Bazan, we tend to remember what comes first and what comes last. So if you have a list of things, learners are more likely to remember what's at the top and what's at the bottom. The middle gets a bit kind of woolly. So write them randomly all over your board in a random fashion as they come out. And then once you've got them there, you need to start connecting the ideas and looking at them in a more organized way. So you can start drawing lines, you can start making connections, you can start doing all kinds of things there. you can start looking at ideas which are similar, ideas which are connected, ideas which are opposite. But please, do that on the board and give learners this idea that all ideas are valuable and that we're just going to sort them out. At this point, it's very important to note as well that bad ideas will drop out by themselves. If learners make a suggestion that's inappropriate or not particularly useful, when you have other suggestions around it, it may very well be that ultimately our learners realize that their suggestion is probably not the best, and it just kind of naturally falls to the wayside. And that also means that we don't have to criticize learners. And then at the bottom of the list, now we can start to say, okay, which of these ideas do we think we should cover first? Which more likely to go next, and so on and so forth. So what we've done is we've generated a lot of ideas, we've connected, we start to filter, and then we start to arrange. We don't jump from structure to ideas. We go from ideas to structure, and that's very, very important indeed. So please follow that logic. We quite often tend to jump to the plan. No, the plan helps express ideas, not create ideas. Okay? So brainstorm from the question, arrange ideas, and so on and so forth. Just a couple more words about this and things to more general ideas here. Please, when you're brainstorming, be careful about being judgmental. We want to encourage our learners to just play around with ideas. And I think it's very important that we make sure we don't damage that. The analogy I usually use is this. When we go, if you watch, I think it's like National Geographic or Discovery, these channels, there are quite a lot these days of documentaries. Documentaries, they're not really documentaries, it's all staged. But of people looking for gold. They do panning for gold or they go mining for gold. But you must have seen in a movie where people go panning for gold. They put a kind of big dish thing into the lake or the river and they pull it out and they start swirling it around. Now, when they pull that pan out of the lake, they do not expect it to be full of gold. They know that it's mostly going to be full of mud. They are not surprised or disappointed that it's full of mud. What they do is they work with that, and eventually they will find the little flecks of gold, and they're usually quite small, that are in that pan, and that's what they're working towards, because it's worth the work, because those flecks of gold are worth the time. So when we're looking at brainstorming, a lot of what we get is going to be mud. It's not going to be appropriate, but that shouldn't be a surprise, and it shouldn't stop us, and it certainly shouldn't be criticized. Our job when we're brainstorming is to get as much as we can and look for the little flecks of gold within those ideas. And remember what I said earlier, to write a standard composition for most exam formats, we don't need too many of them. What we do need is to train our learners to be comfortable with thinking quickly. If they're worried about being criticized, that's not going to happen. If they're worried they're going to get it wrong, that's not going to happen. In an exam situation, I want them to be able to sit down and think very, very quickly, come up with ideas, chunk, 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 and trust themselves enough to know that these ideas are usable and that they can work. If they're used to being criticized, I'm sorry, that process is just not going to happen. Someone sharing their experience. I thank you very much in that, Maria. Thank you very much indeed for because I didn't say we were talking about providing my pupils with the ideas instead of just suggestions. Thank you very much for sharing, Maria. And trust me, we've all done it. And when I speak about problems in the classroom, please, all of you understand that basically I'm talking about mistakes that I made and I had to put right. So this is not me pretending I know everything. Like you, I learned from experience, and I just have the good fortune to be able to share that with you. And you are kind enough to listen to me as I share it. So thank you very much, Maria, for your comment and your honesty in that. Much appreciated. And nice to know I'm not the only one who gets things wrong. So please, final point on this because we need to move on, but please, please, please watch your facial expressions when you're doing things like brainstorming. I talked in the previous seminar about something called micro expressions. If when a learner gives you a suggestion, your face just for a second looks disapproving, even though you're not consciously doing it, they're going to be put off. All the way through brainstorming, we have to think, this is good. Our first response whenever a learner offers an idea is thank you. Let's have a look at that. We encourage them by thanking them, by working with it, by not rejecting out of hand. Okay, so please keep it positive, keep it constructive. And as I said, bad ideas, if you've got enough ideas, the bad ones will fall by the wayside on their own, and you don't need to worry about it. Do not judge. Brainstorming is about the mud. The flecks of gold are in there. Occasionally, have fun with it. Here is a brainstorming question and in the same module. It's not about the specific title because that says shopping. Here it says points for and against credit cards. And one of the things I do with teachers, we can't do it now because in this format it doesn't work, is I ask them for the most stupid thing they could do with a credit card. Now, what I always find when I ask that is for the first few seconds, maybe half a minute or so, nobody answers. Because like students, teachers are also looking for the right answer. When we brainstorm, we're not looking for the right answer. And what I normally get here is someone make a suggestion, like they'll say, you know, lend it to my friend. And I say, look, you're still being a little literal. Think of the credit card. Think of a piece of plastic like a credit card. What's a stupid thing to do with that? And slowly we get to, like, you know, buttering my toast, or trying to eat soup, or using it as a ruler, or trying to cut bread with it. And eventually, once one or two people have these silly ideas and they realize that it's okay, suddenly we get this avalanche of silly ideas for things to use as a credit card. So, is it useful to write dictations? I don't know, dictations, just quickly because that's there. Dictations are not really a way of encouraging creativity, which is what we're talking about now, and generating ideas. Dictation we normally use at lower levels because dictation is very much about learning the way that language is pronounced and learning the connection between the sound and the written form. Dictation has a place, certainly down at primary level, and possibly at slightly higher levels to tune their ear in for listening, but it's not really within the remit of what we're talking about now. And I'm sorry if I was speaking quickly. I'll slow down a bit. Sometimes when I get excited, I speed up, and so I apologize for that. I got carried away. So sometimes just play with ideas, have fun with them, think of stupid things, encourage learners to think outside the box, laugh if they come up with a funny idea. It doesn't mean they're going to use it in their composition. What it means is their imagination is working, and that's what we need to encourage. Ideas don't break. You can bounce them, you can twist them. They don't break. So have fun with it sometimes. Allow a bit of fun with it. Now, we've generated our ideas. Now we're going to move into putting those ideas on paper in a way that makes sense. Things that we really need to think about as teachers when we're teaching compositions are obviously linguistic concerns, and these are just examples of issues, some of which we're going to discuss in a minute, and things like the audience. Now, in the session prior to this one, we just discussed in great depth the idea of audience, bearing in mind the person who is going to receive the piece of writing. These issues I've raised here are based on examiners' reports, and things that examiners say quite often go wrong in composition writing for exams. So we're going to look at these now in a little more detail as we go through. And talk about them for the remaining 5 or 6 minutes. I'd like you all to have a look at this. Can we move my image? Okay, Svetlana is going to move this. In fact, it's only the one word. I can read it to you. There are many football grounds where you can waste your free time. It's okay, it's just one letter. There are many football grounds where you can waste your free time. There are too many sports facilities in this area. This is my favorite one. After a while, the door knocked. And another very complicated one, fingertips were not found, so the burglar had to wear gloves. Now, all of these are obviously sentences written badly, and their meaning is obscured. They are all wrong for the same reason. All of the problems here are based on the fact that learners are translating. I know that because these ones were taken from the exams, the FCE examination that was administered in Greece a few years ago. They're examples of students translating directly from Greek. As I said, I know this with confidence because I speak Greek as well. So, for example, after a while the door knocked is a literal translation of the Greek. because in Greek that sentence is perfectly possible. Also, the idea of fingertips and fingerprints in Greek is kind of, they use the same word, so it's been mistranslated. The idea of there are many football grounds where you can waste your free time is a mistranslation. There are too many sports facilities in Greek. The questions of degree get a bit complicated. So the idea of very many and too many are actually expressed using the same word, but the context and tone of voice will indicate whether it's good or bad. What's happened here is the learners got confused because they're translating and they mistranslated. This is why using translation as a form of teaching learners to write, and I'm not suggesting you do this, it used to happen in the past, is not helpful. Translation is one skill, writing in English is another. And what happens quite often is that learners think too much in their own language, they try to reproduce in their own language, they end up translating, and you end up with horrible sentences like the ones you have on your screen. Native language interference is a problem. Learners should be encouraged when we're learning to write compositions to use language that they have learned, not to run away and use the dictionary. I had a student once who was a very, very good student. You couldn't ask for a better student. He was polite, he was conscientious, he did his homework on time, he answered questions in the lesson, he was a wonderful, wonderful kid. I happen to know his family, they were a lovely family to him. But his compositions were frightening. They were frightening because they were just random and they didn't make sense. And finally, what we realized is that he was writing the whole composition in Greek, and then he was trying to translate it into English using a bilingual dictionary. Now, of course, as you know, in a bilingual dictionary, there are different translations maybe for the same word, depending on the context. He didn't know that. So he was basically using the first translation he found in the dictionary to write his composition. It was absolutely horrible and so frustrating for me because I hated giving this learner bad marks because he was such a good student. Eventually, we solved the problem by basically taking away the translation dictionary and encouraging him to use language that we'd learned in the lesson, language that he knew he'd heard in English. And his work improved because I said he was an excellent student and thankfully he was fine by exam time. But it was a kind of weird experience. This issue of register is also a problem to think about in getting the right writing right. And this issue is solved by bearing in mind the recipient of my communication. The learners tend to jump around. It's not that they get formal and informal confused, it's that they tend to, how can I say it? They tend to jump around between formal and informal. Part of the problem here is that they're not really aware of who they're writing to, the person who's receiving this. If you bear in mind that you're writing to your boss, you will write in one way. If you bear in mind you're writing to a friend, you write in another way. So it's very, very important that we establish in our learners' minds who this person is. Get them to imagine them. Get them to imagine the kind of office the person is in. Get them to imagine the kind of clothes the person wears, the kind of person that they are, so that they have a very clear idea of whom the direction that the writing is being directed towards. This way, it will remain more stable. A lot of the time, the problem is learners are writing into a void, into a gap. They have no idea of where they're writing to, and that can be a problem. One way of helping with this as well, got a couple more minutes, is to show them lots of models and examples. Don't worry about this. This is just Jeremy Harmer explaining this idea of parallel writing, which is essentially writing using models. You show them English, the style that you want, and learners learn from that. We always use models when we ask learners to do writing. We do parallel writing. But what I would suggest you do is when you have a model, please, 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 please explore it carefully. Ask learners questions about it. What makes this effective? What didn't work? What did you like? What did you not like? If you were to change this, what might you change? So when you're looking at a model, and you will find them in all course books where there's writing, please just don't say, look at the model, write the composition. Learners need to engage with it and to think about it. This way, it should have a positive influence on their writing. Even if it's to improve on the model, that will have a positive influence on their writing as well. So please make sure that you actively always engage with the model there. This backs up what I was just saying. Learners need to consider the bigger picture. They need to have a clear idea of the situation and the target reader. And this will enable them to write in an appropriately formal or informal way. So the models help. Also a clear idea of what I'm trying to achieve and the recipient of my communication. When you're looking, for example, there at expressions and teaching learners synonyms and different expressions for composition writing, please, please, please also discuss with them the formality or informality of expressions, which would be more likely to appear in formal writing, which are more informal, because they're not always at the same level. So when you come across activities like the one in the screen, please explore them just a little bit and talk about where they would be appropriate, where they're best designed for, and get learners to think about contextualizing them just a little bit. Another great thing to do to help learners avoid mistakes is to use models that are wrong and get learners to correct them. Now you can use this from a course book or you can have an old composition from another year without the name that you can photocopy and ask learners to correct. This also helps them when they're proofreading their own work to be able to do that. Now to finish, just to finish on my points here, just to show you what we've been talking about. Let's imagine that you have just been given, you just got yourself a new job, which means you're going to leave your current job. Get learners to think about, for example, the different ways they would relate the same news. So if you're writing to your present boss, what are you going to do? You're going to inform them that you're leaving. But what are you really trying to do? You're really trying to make sure that you leave in a nice atmosphere. So you're not going to tell your current boss, I'm leaving and I'm so happy I'll never see you again. Ha-ha! You're going to thank them for the time that you spent at work. You're going to thank them for all you've learned, so that when you leave the company, that you do so in a way that leaves a good impression. You don't irritate your old boss. Maybe you could ask them for a reference. So whenever we're writing, we have to think about what we're really trying to achieve, not just formal or informal. What am I really trying to get? And how is that going to influence what I write? When I'm writing to my friend, I'm honest. I tell them all the wonderful things I'm thinking and all the things I hated about my old job. If I'm writing to turn down a job offer from a company that I don't want, I'm not going to make them feel bad. I'm not going to pretend I just don't like them. I'm going to thank them for their job offer. I'm going to apologize for not being able to take it, but thank them for their most kind offer. Why? Because in the future, I may want to get back in touch with them again. So, and the things I put in my composition, it's not just the information, it's the way I phrase that information. How do I know how I phrase that information? By deciding what my ultimate goal is. It's to not offend, it's to keep doors open, it's to get a good reputation, and ultimately it's to give the impression that I want. I'm going to jump to my last slide, which is right here. So we almost finished on time. Once we've done the composition writing, just quickly these final points. When you're marking composition, please remember the difference between errors and mistakes. If it's a slip of the tongue, if it's a slip of the pen, the world is, it doesn't really matter. If, however, our learners have genuinely, obviously misunderstood something, then you need to reteach it. Don't criticize them if they forget a final S on the third person singular once. If they do it repeatedly, then okay, double check it. Do you have time for self-correction and second drafting? Sometimes that's a great idea. Give them back to the learners and say, look at this again, you need to think about it. If you have time, if your syllabus, the things you have to get through will allow you to do that, it's a great thing to do. Look at composition writing. Is there something that all the class seems to be misunderstanding? If yes, make sure you teach it to the whole class. Don't just speak to one or two specific individuals. That's very important as well. What can you learn from this? What grammar should you teach a little more carefully? What vocabulary had they obviously not picked up? What about the style of the writing that they didn't understand? What messages can you as teacher take away from the mistakes or whatever that appear in the composition? And always, 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 correction should be formulative. It should be about what you need them to do, not just about what they got wrong. Give them suggestions, let them know what to look at, encourage them so that next time this composition will provide a basis to move forward and write even better work. Because otherwise it really becomes a bit of a waste of time. Always formulative, always constructive, and always positive. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm overrun again, but it's so much fun talking about some of this stuff. Thank you for your kind comments. Let me give you my email. Oh gosh, lots of questions. Oh gosh, let me just quickly look at those. Some of them I've already answered. Graphic organizers, very quickly, I use mind maps. I love mind mapping. I write things on the board. I start with a central idea. I find personally mind mapping helps me immensely. Yes, you're right about American and British spelling. You do have to point that out. They must be consistent. And the only way they can do that is by proofreading their own work and you pointing out which is the American and which is the British. Either is okay in exams, but you're right, they must be consistent. Make a point of underlining that. Make a point in some course books, like at the back, they have British and English comparisons. Draw that to their attention. If it isn't in your course book, we do have it usually. If it's not in your course book, you can find it online. They should have that in front of them so that they know what the differences are. I'm afraid that's just experiences. It's just experience that they need to gain, and you need to correct it and point it out. Okay, I think that's all the questions there that I got. Let me just give you my email to finish. Again, I apologize for those of you, I've said this before, I'm giving you a short email because I have to type. My business email is quite long. So there is my email. If there are any things that I haven't addressed, I apologize. Please drop me a line. I'm happy to discuss it. I learn a lot from your questions. My time now is coming to an end here. It's the final one of the day. Thank you for sticking with me, those that you have. Sorry about the occasional slip of the tongue. But I've been speaking incessantly since early this morning, and some of you have been very kind enough to listen to it. So hopefully next time I'm in Russia, we'll have another series of webinars. I have some more ideas to share with you. Very much look forward to having you on board. And I wish you a good remainder of the day wherever you are in this lovely country. I hope your day has gone well and the rest of it goes even better. So a very goodbye, a very good evening from Moscow. And until next time, that's it. Thank you very much indeed.